Tower, this is Sierra 1, coming in.
There's a sound a flight deck makes right before something goes wrong. Not an alarm. Not yet. Just a shift in the rhythm. The wind catches differently. The noise drops half a decibel. And every single person who's spent real time out there feels it before they can explain why. On the morning this story starts, a woman walked across that deck for the first time, and a handful of men who'd been flying off carriers for years looked at her, looked at each other, and laughed. Out loud, where she could hear it. They had no idea that inside of 6 hours, every single one of them would be looking up at the sky, waiting on her, and her alone, to bring 3 of their own back down alive. If you love stories where the people doing the laughing end up eating every word of it, subscribe right now before we go any further, because that's basically the entire premise of this channel. And I want you playing along with me tonight. At some point in this story, you're going to have a pretty good guess about what her call sign actually means. When you get there, stop and put it in the comments before I say it out loud. I want to see how many of you get there first. Let's rewind, because you need to feel the morning the way she felt it before we get anywhere near what happened later that day. Her name, for tonight's story, was Lieutenant Maya Solis, 29 years old, and she was stepping onto that carrier deck as the newest addition to a strike fighter squadron that had, up until that point, never had a woman flying with them. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further, because I think it matters. This isn't a story about hatred. Nobody on that deck that morning wished her harm. What happened was smaller than that, and in some ways more insidious, because it's the kind of thing that's easy to laugh off afterward, easy to call harmless. A few of the deck crew, watching her walk toward her assigned aircraft in a flight suit that, to their eyes, looked like it belonged on someone else entirely, actually laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, the way people laugh at something that doesn't fit their picture of how the world is supposed to work. One of them, a senior chief who'd been on that flight deck longer than Maya had been alive in a certain sense, not literally, but close enough that it might as well have been true, turned to a younger sailor next to him and said, loud enough for at least 3 people to hear it clearly, "This ought to be interesting." He wasn't shouting it. He didn't need to. Some comments carry just fine at a normal volume when the person saying them assumes nobody's really going to push back. Maya heard it. Of course she heard it. And here's the thing I want you to really sit with, because I think it's the emotional truth underneath this entire story. She didn't turn around. Didn't say a word. Just kept walking toward her jet with the exact same pace she'd had before the laugh, like it had landed somewhere that simply didn't register as worth reacting to. Which, honestly, might have made it land even harder for the men who'd said it, though none of them would have admitted that at the time. I want to ask you something here, early on, because I think it's going to matter by the time we're done tonight. Have you ever walked into a room where you could feel people deciding, instantly, what you were capable of, before you'd done a single thing to earn that judgment either way? Sit with that. We're coming back to it. What none of those men on that deck knew, because it wasn't the kind of thing you'd know just by looking at someone, and Maya had never once volunteered it, was that she'd come up through one of the most demanding advanced strike training pipelines the Navy runs, a program built specifically around exactly the kind of high-pressure, split-second precision that carrier operations demand at their absolute worst. She'd graduated near the top of a brutal class. Her instructors, in evaluations that never made it into casual hangar conversation, had flagged her more than once as one of the most technically precise pilots they'd trained in years, someone whose actual weakness, if you could even call it that, was that she was so quietly competent that people sometimes mistook her calm for a lack of confidence, rather than what it actually was, which was the opposite. She'd earned a call sign during that training, the way these things usually happen, not something she picked for herself, but something instructors hung on her after a specific moment that stuck. During a live exercise involving a simulated multi-aircraft emergency scenario where two other pilots in her cohort had visibly, understandably, struggled to keep their composure as the scenario compounded, Maya had worked through it with a level of unhurried, methodical focus that one of her instructors later described as almost unnerving to watch in the best possible way. He told her afterward, half joking but not entirely, that watching her work a crisis was like watching someone balance a ledger. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed, every number in its place no matter how fast things were falling apart around her. The name stuck, the way call signs do. They called her Ledger. None of that traveled with her onto that flight deck that morning. All anyone saw was a woman who looked, to their eyes, like she didn't belong in the picture they already had of who flies off a carrier. And I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because it's such a small, human thing, how fast we build a whole story about someone based on almost nothing, and how confidently we act on that story once we've built it. Maya flew her assigned sorties that first day without incident, competent, quiet, giving nobody on that deck any particular reason to revise their opinion of her one way or another, because a routine flight rarely gives anyone the chance to actually see what a pilot is made of. The senior chief who'd made the comment that morning didn't apologize, didn't really think about it again, and by all accounts, the rest of the crew mostly forgot the moment had even happened, the way small cruelties often get forgotten by the people who commit them and remembered, much longer, by the people who absorbed them. That brings us to the afternoon. The squadron had 3 aircraft up on a routine training sortie when weather that had been forecast as manageable turned considerably less manageable, considerably faster than anyone on that ship expected. A fast-moving system rolled in off the horizon with the kind of speed that turns a routine flight into a genuine problem in the space of about 15 minutes, dropping visibility, kicking up crosswinds that made a carrier landing, already one of the hardest things a pilot ever learns to do, into something considerably more dangerous. 3 aircraft, 3 pilots, all needing to get back onto that pitching, wind-battered deck before fuel became the second crisis stacked on top of the first. Here's where it gets complicated, and here's where Maya's entire day quietly turned. Of the 4 pilots qualified and available to help talk the incoming aircraft down through deteriorating conditions, a role that, on a carrier, requires an almost impossibly precise combination of technical knowledge and ice-cold communication under pressure, 3 were already dealing with their own competing responsibilities on deck as the weather worsened. The 4th was Maya. The air boss, coordinating the recovery from the tower, made the call that afternoon based on nothing more sentimental than simple necessity. He needed someone who could talk 3 increasingly stressed pilots through a landing sequence that was about to get considerably harder than any of them had trained for that week, and Maya was the pilot available and qualified to do it. Whatever anyone on that deck had assumed about her that morning had absolutely no bearing on the math the air boss was doing in that moment. He needed competence, immediately, and her file said she had it. What followed, over the next roughly 22 minutes, became the kind of story that gets told and retold on that ship for years afterward. The exact kind of thing sailors bring up unprompted when they're trying to explain to someone new what a really good day at a really hard job actually looks like. Maya took the radio and, according to 2 people who were in that tower with her, transformed instantly into someone the flight deck had absolutely no context for. Calm in a way that didn't sound performed, precise in a way that only comes from someone who has run this exact scenario in her head 100 times before she ever needed it for real. She talked the first aircraft down through a crosswind correction that shaved just enough margin back into a landing that, Without her guidance, several witnesses believe would have required a wave-off and a considerably more dangerous second attempt in worsening conditions. The second aircraft came in with a fuel state tight enough that there wasn't really room for a second attempt at all, and Maya walked that pilot through an approach adjustment so specific, so exactly tailored to the deteriorating wind pattern she was watching in real time, that the pilot himself later said, almost word for word, that it felt like she was flying the aircraft right alongside him from 300 feet away. The third aircraft, the most stressed pilot of the group by that point, came in last, and Maya's voice on that final approach, according to the tower crew, never once changed pitch, never once carried even a hint of the tension that everyone else in that room was visibly holding in their shoulders. She talked him all the way down to the deck, wheels touching in conditions that, 40 minutes earlier, nobody on that ship would have called safe for a carrier landing at all. All three aircraft were down. All three pilots were safe. And for a few seconds after that last jet rolled to a stop, according to the tower crew, absolutely nobody said anything, because there wasn't really anything left to say that would have added to what they'd all just watched happen. I want you to picture the deck after that. Word travels fast on a ship, faster than almost anywhere else I can think of, and within the hour, everyone who'd been anywhere near that flight deck that morning knew exactly whose voice had just talked three aircraft through the worst weather that ship had seen in months. The senior chief who'd made that comment about her that morning found her later that evening, according to someone who witnessed it, and didn't try to explain it away or make a joke of it. He just told her, plainly, that he'd been wrong, and that he was sorry it had taken something like that afternoon for him to say so. Maya, from what I understand, didn't make a big moment out of accepting it. She just nodded, said something short about how everyone has a bad read on someone sometimes, and let it go, the same understated way she seemed to let almost everything go. But something on that ship shifted after that day, quietly, the way real change usually does rather than the dramatic way we sometimes imagine it. Pilots who'd barely spoken to her before started actually seeking out her read on things. The call sign that had followed her quietly through training started getting used out loud on that ship for the first time. And it started carrying weight the moment people understood exactly what it meant and exactly how she'd earned it. Here's what stays with me about this story, and I think it's worth sitting with for a second before we wrap up tonight. Nobody on that deck that morning was trying to be cruel in some grand, dramatic way. It was smaller than that, and honestly, more common than most of us would like to admit. A quick, careless judgment about who belongs where, made in about 2 seconds, based on nothing except what someone looked like they should be capable of. And it took a genuine emergency, something entirely outside anyone's control, to force that assumption to collide head-on with the truth. Maya didn't need that afternoon to prove anything to herself. She already knew what she was capable of. She just needed a few other people to catch up. So here's my question for you tonight, and I really do want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think moments like that one, where someone finally sees the truth, but only because a crisis forced their hand, actually change people for good? Or do you think, deep down, some of those assumptions just get quieter without ever really disappearing? And tell me the other thing too. Had you already guessed, before I said it, what her call sign was going to mean, and why she'd earned it? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists for exactly these moments. The ones who get laughed at walking in, and who leave the room completely silent walking out. And if you've got a story like this one, something you've lived or heard that reminds you of Maya, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the best stories I've ever told on this channel started exactly there. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.